Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lovely, lovely University of Maastricht. I am Kirsten van den Hul, and I am going to be your host for today's session. I hope you knew that this would be in English, and that there's nobody in the audience who thinks, oops. I also would like to extend a special welcome to the people, now I'm waving to the cameras, to the people joining us via live stream. The link will also still be available after this session. So if you would like to see if the debate was indeed as interesting as it sounded the first time, then you can look it up online. What we are doing today is actually quite special. I call this Democracy 2.0. Because what we have here today, this town hall session on human rights, is actually the last in a series of consultations by Minister Frans Timmermans, building up towards a new human rights policy that will be presented to a Dutch parliament later this spring. So you are lucky that you are part of the last public consultation, and there will actually be ample opportunity for you to participate. There is already a hashtag. It has been on for a while now, and the hashtag is MR2013. And if you would like to join the debate, which we'll have at the end of this town hall meeting, and please start tweeting, or you can also leave your comments on Minister Timmermans' website page, Facebook page, and then you can join the debate. Of course, you can also just raise your hands 1.0 style. That's also still allowed. What we are going to do today is we are going to listen to a wide range of speakers. Ranging from politicians and women's activists from Syria that we are very honored to have in our midst, to a professor that you may know from this university, to the director of COC Netherlands, Koen van Dijk, and we will also hear from one of your students who will give a speech about human rights. And of course, Mr. Timmermans himself, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will first of all give a speech and then, like I said, engage in a Q&A session. Maybe it's totally not necessary to remind you to switch off your cell phones, or at least put them on silent or flight mode, or whatever you would like to call it. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Ms. Hildegard Snijder.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Minister Timmermans. I'm very glad that you came back to your hometown, to Maastricht, and that you use this place, the University of Maastricht, for your last consultation on human rights. The university, and especially the Faculty of Law, has a very warm heart to human rights. Already since its foundation as faculty in 1981 and 1982, with the appointments of the Professors Van Boven and Flinteman, human rights were center of our faculty's interest. And I think already in the 80s, with the formulation of the Maastricht guidelines, with the 90s, the Limburg principles, and only more recently in 2011, with the Maastricht principles on extraterritorial obligation of states concerning economic, social, and cultural rights, I think Maastricht always has shown in the faculty that human rights is the basic of our research, our interest in all our education, with the Maastricht Center of Human Rights, but also with many courses in this area. So for us, we are very proud that you are here. You have been earlier here a couple of times. We have celebrated with you the 40 years of the European Union, which I think is also some special occasion for us here when you were speaking to us. But I know you are an excellent debater, and I think it's a pleasure for us, but also for students, to discuss with you the future policy of the Netherlands. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dean Hildegard Schneider. Now it is my honor to introduce one of your own professors. He is Professor of International Law and he is the Director of the Maastricht Center for Human Rights. His name is Menno Kamminga.
Last week, President Putin visited the Netherlands. And of course, human rights issues were raised. President Putin reacted to questions about human rights in Russia by saying, what about the Netherlands? You allow a political party in the Netherlands that is opposed to women being elected in political posts. What about human rights in the Netherlands? He also could have raised the death of Alexander Dolmatov, the Russian asylum seeker that committed suicide in January in a Dutch detention center. Of course, these reactions from a legal point of view are not very strong. In human rights law, it's well accepted that a human rights violation in one country cannot be used as a justification for a human rights violation in another country. But politically, such a response that also goes back to the Soviet years is very effective because it says, practice what you preach. And I think that's one of the main themes that should be in any foreign policy on human rights. The most convincing foreign policy is when you do exactly as to the commitments that you're holding others accountable for. And I think in the Netherlands, there is some room for improvement there. Dutch asylum policy has been criticized, not only in the Dolmatov case, but by the European Court of Human Rights, several judgments. And in previous years, the Netherlands government, in my view, hasn't reacted in the way it should have reacted by saying, well, maybe we don't agree with the judgment of the court, but of course we will faithfully implement whatever Strasbourg tells us to do. That's why we have a European Court of Human Rights. Because in that way, you strengthen the belief in human rights and you strengthen your own position when you're holding others to account. Unfortunately, under the previous government, at least the foreign minister, several times suggested that the court hadn't done the right thing, that they should have left the Netherlands with a wider room for maneuver. My hope would be that the new foreign minister will take a different attitude, that he will take an attitude in which he says, maybe I don't agree with everything that Strasbourg tells us, but I'm going to implement it because I believe in human rights, and that's why we're going to do what the court tells us. Another example. There are quite a few human rights instruments at the moment, human rights treaties, all kinds of subjects. The Netherlands hasn't yet ratified all of these instruments, and I think they should do so very quickly, because by doing so, they show their commitment to human rights. I give two examples. The UN Treaty on the Rights of Disabled Persons, the Netherlands is not yet a party, and also the optional protocol to the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, which provides for the right of individuals to submit complaints that their social and economic rights have been violated. And this is more problematic in my view because the Netherlands has a long record of being skeptical about social and economic rights. The Netherlands has always been in favor of civil and political rights, freedom of expression, death penalty, torture. The Netherlands has always been in the forefront. But when it comes to social and economic rights, the right to work, the right to health, the Netherlands has been reluctant. And I think it would be a great gesture for this government to say, we are going to accept that individuals can complain to Geneva, in this case, if they feel their social and economic rights have been violated. So I appeal to the government to implement and ratify that instrument. Now, as I said, there are many human rights treaties at the moment. the rights of the individual at the moment are very well covered by these treaties. There are many human rights treaties with complaints mechanisms. It's very impressive, at least on paper. So the states have to respect human rights. That's very well covered by international law. At the same time, we have international criminal tribunals, which ensure that individuals can be held to account for human rights violations. Even presidents, premiers, ministers can be brought to trial before the International Criminal Court. And I can assure you that that will gradually start to happen. So for states and for individuals, we have a good system in place. Where we don't have a system in place is for companies, for business, which is very surprising because business companies, of course, are the great winners of the globalization phenomenon. They are taking advantage of globalization. They can invest anywhere around the world. They have grown tremendously, but they're not bound by international human rights norms. I think that's a big gap. I think it's very unfortunate. The Netherlands is the seat of many multinational corporations, and I think the Netherlands should take the lead in ensuring that that gap is filled. In other words, that we have a treaty which formulates the human rights standards that should be respected by companies. We have some guidelines for business and human rights at the moment, but these are just, they're not binding, they're recommendations, and in my view, they're also weakly formulated. So they could be considered like a first step, but the next step should be a treaty. The Netherlands could make a major contribution there. And the Netherlands was in the forefront when it came to formulating human rights treaties against torture, for the abolition of the death penalty in the past. I would like the Netherlands to take that place again in the forefront of the building of human rights machinery. Now, one of the questions with human rights always is, are you only going to criticize your enemies or also your friends? And of course, it's easy to criticize North Korea because it's not going to damage our trade interests, nobody's going to care, but also it's going to have very little impact. So for any human rights foreign policy, it's crucial that you're also willing to stick out your neck and criticize your allies. And for the Netherlands, that means criticizing countries like Israel and the United States. Israel for its settlements policies. As Israel continues to build settlements on the West Bank, contrary to the judgments of the International Court of Justice, the Netherlands should clearly speak out against this, in my view. I know it's being done already to some extent, but it should be absolutely clear that this is unacceptable, because it also undermines the possibilities for peace in the Middle East. As far as the United States is concerned, I think a major issue of discussion should be the use of drones for killing opponents. As you know, the United States is widely using drones now, not only in war zones, where the use of drones may be justified because you're killing combatants of the enemy. That's allowed in wartime, but drones also are used in peace, in areas which are not obvious areas where there is armed conflict, like in Yemen. It's not so obvious that you can do the same thing there as you're doing in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. So I would like to see that the Netherlands questions the use of drones by the United States. The public often, and the minister, I hope, will agree with me, the public often expects a lot from the Netherlands, that the Netherlands can bring to human rights to the world. Often that is a bit naive. The public should realize that the world is not going to change because the Netherlands tells them to change and to become good human rights respecters. That's not the way it works. On the other hand, the thing about a foreign policy on human rights is that you should never assume that the other side is a unity. In other words, that when a dictatorship says we're not interested in human rights, we have other priorities, then you shouldn't assume that all officials, all politicians in that country have the same view. There are always people, there are always opponents who have a different view. And those are the people you can help, you can assist, if only morally assist, by making it clear what the Netherlands' position is on human rights issues. And that, I think, is the function of a human rights policy. You should put pressure where it's necessary, make known your views, and you never know what impact it will have, because somebody in the government machinery will feel this as support in the back. The Netherlands used to have a very good reputation in the field of human rights. I'm referring back to ministers like Van der Stoel, the late Max van der Stoel, and the late Pieter Kooijmans, who died recently. They really put the Netherlands on the map as a country for which human rights is the leading aspect of foreign policy. And they're still remembered for that. And I know that the minister is a great admirer of Max van der Stoel, is even a former worked with Max van der Stoel. So probably I'm preaching for the converted, but I would like to state it nevertheless. I would hope that you, Minister, would take those two people as your example, and that again you would put the Netherlands on the map as a beacon of light, as a country that has adopted human rights as its key element of its foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kamminga. Now, I already said this is no democracy 1.0, this is democracy 2.0. So, of course, we're not only going to listen to professors and deans, but we're also going to hear from students. The next person I'm going to introduce is not an ordinary student, though. She studies forensics, criminology, and law, but also practices law in the Philippines. She's an honor student here at the University of Maastricht, and it's an honor to announce her to you, Angela Aguilado. There you go. The mic is yours.
If you would allow me to ask, who of you here has a significant other? Kindly raise your hands. Yes. And would you agree with me that if you have a significant other, you would love and support that significant other of yours, or any other loved one, and you would do anything for them? And at the same time, you would expect something similar or the same from your significant other. But how would you feel if your significant other, out of love and support for you, is brutally killed, raped, mutilated, and then thrown somewhere where her remains or his remains wouldn't be found? Your Excellency, Foreign Minister Frans Timmermans, Your Excellency, Ambassador for Human Rights, Univier, Dean Hildegard Schneider, members of the faculty, fellow students, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. Let me tell you a story. On November 2009, the late Jeneline Mangudatu volunteered out of love and support for her husband to file a certificate of candidacy on his behalf, together with other women and members of the media and lawyers. However, they never reached their destination. They were abducted, killed with high-powered firearms, and the women were raped, their genitalia mutilated, heads beheaded before they were thrown to a pre-excavated pit. Worse, this was done by no less than local government officials using their private armies, while the law enforcement agencies refused to help. And in the face of these incomprehensible atrocities, what has been done? The Philippine government remained lethargic, almost non-reactive. This vicious cycle of extrajudicial killings, gender-based violence continues to happen in the Philippines and similarly situated countries. The same can be said about neighboring countries who knew the situation and yet they don't do anything about it. An oft-quoted exhortation would teach us that evil would triumph if good men and women would do nothing. Hence, if I were the foreign minister for a day, I would be more proactive. We often hear concepts in human rights about responsibility to protect, humanitarian intervention, and yet we fail or refuse to apply these issues, at least on our own initiative, to issues or human rights violations that happen in the dark shadows, like extrajudicial killings, gender-based violence, even discrimination against lesbian, bisexuals, gays, and whatnot. When we have so much potential and we can take that extra step to do so, every one of us has the potential to be good, to be a man for others, to do more, be more, or like the values of badges, like what I was being taught in the Jesuit education back home. And we have so much resources and potential to do so. First, on one hand, we have the youth, whose ideals and passions is untainted by any political or economical motivation. They are the best people to promote human rights, to promote awareness, to expose human rights violations. On the other hand, we have the social media. Who of you here has not used Facebook or Twitter at least once a day? I myself admit to that I use Facebook and Twitter. And nowadays, we see non-governmental organizations like Aware Singapore or human rights organizations use the social media to expose violations. Even citizen journalism and investigative or journalism uses this social media to promote human rights. But at the end of the day, you might ask me, wouldn't it be easier to just take a seat, watch the show, and be reactive and apply the solution whenever the problem arises? Wouldn't it be that easier? Let me leave you with the words of John F. Kennedy when he spoke about the mission of the United States to the moon. We're doing this battle for human rights not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because it is the outcome that will surely measure and organize our skills and energies, that it is a goal that we are willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and it is a battle for human rights that are willing and intending to win. We should allow the wheels of justice or human rights not to grind slowly, for us not to shame our past efforts to promote human rights. With that, thank you and good day.
Well spoken.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela Aguinaldo. Thank you very much for your inspiring words. Do you know what a shiro is? It's a word that I sometimes use. It's a female hero. Well, we have two sheroes in our midst today. They are originally all the way from Syria. And I would like to welcome them to join me on stage. And their names are Muna Ghanem and Basma Kodmani. Welcome. Please have a seat. Yes, Muna, you're a women's activist and a politician and also co-initiator of the Syrian Women Making Peace Forum. And Basma, you're a Syrian academic and also former spokesperson of the Syrian National Council and executive director of the Arab Reform Initiative. And you're
part of this Syrian Women's Network now.
Wow, that's an impressive list on your resume. And I should also mention that both of you are here on the invitation of HIFOS. Yes. Women's agenda in Syria right now. What is on the agenda?
I would say the protection of civilians before anything else. Speaking of women's issues is not very useful nor relevant at a time when children are killed, young men are mutilated, and the civilian population is under very, very dire conditions and in danger constantly. Anybody coming from Syria, Muna coming from Damascus, says, I am afraid when I travel from one point to another. So I think what our main message first is protection of civilians. And this has not been provided so far by any effective means. Aid to the population is just not reaching the population properly. Now, women's agenda, yes, we do have an agenda and an immediate one, and that is women's participation in the decision-making on the current situation, in a transition period, positioning women and finding the right approach to get women to be part of the decision-making. They are part of the resistance, and that tells you that this is a population resisting against a dictatorship. Women are fully part of that context and effort, but they need to be part of the decision-making because they have really a lot of interesting ideas, approaches, and we believe that women can bridge among communities probably better than those who have fought on the ground.
But how is there enough space now for women to actually participate in that process?
Actually, now we, as a woman activist, and the women movement in Syria is facing many challenges. The most important things is the increasing of conservatism movement among the struggle, the political struggle in Syria, and this has its shadows on the women issues, and we are worried about this. The second thing that we strongly believe that there is no democracy without women empowerment and involvement, and add to what my good friend Basma has mentioned, that political participation, I would say also women empowerment, economically empowerment, social empowerment. Enough space, it's now difficult for everybody to have an activist in Syria, but we are still insisting to work from inside the country. I'm coming from a political movement who organize workshop inside Damascus under the bombing and under the explosion everywhere. We think that we should lead the transition with a gender eye open also on what's happening, and to that end we will launch a workshop next week on doing a gender to address the gender sensitive challenges in the transitional period, because it's not that we want to change the regime, but we want to have a gender sensitive democratic system in the future. Also, I heard Madame Clinton always saying human rights is women rights and women rights is a human rights. As Basma said, you cannot have women rights without general context for human right. I think now, also one last point, I think we should learn from the experiences of the democratic transition in two parts of the world. The first part of the world, it's East Europe, when the women get into the transition very weak, and they were the target of the population to carry the burden of the transition, and we should address this issue. And I think a country like your country should always focus on bringing women to this transition as a powerful agent, not a weak agent. And also we should learn from the experience of women in Afghanistan, where the conservative forces get power, and the women were the first to pay the result of this. So this is two cases which I see my country might be under the same scenario to some extent.
Now, you already mentioned the role of the Netherlands, but what can Holland do specifically? What should the international community do specifically to promote the participation of women?
I suppose Holland has not only a reputation in human rights, but also a reputation of being very practical in its approach and therefore effective. I think the immediate message from me would be humanitarian aid should be channeled through women. And if that can be organized, and it can be organized because there are efforts on the ground by women who are developing this kind of work, I think this would be one very powerful means for women to reappear in the public space in spite of a very violent and difficult environment, and to build a base and to build to appear, to have a voice, and to show that they are real players in the current context. I think the other, perhaps more medium and long term, would be to tell us about strategies, approaches, what kinds of instruments can be put forward and used to activate issues around women's empowerment and participation. At the current moment, I think we need help in the field of human rights generally. The atrocities, the crimes that are committed inside prisons, people are being killed inside prisons more and more. So we know there are crimes against humanity. We need help in that area. And if women lawyers, but women in general, can come together and be the hub for organizing a very serious international action towards prosecution, towards preparing for transitional justice. Not enough is being done, and time is very, very precious, because what is lost and not documented, not worked on, will be lost forever, and reconciliation will depend on it.
Now, there's a lot of individuals here in this room, individual students, individual human rights activists, and people often ask me, like, what can an individual do? There's so many people who feel compassion and who feel pain when they watch the news, but is there anything that individuals can do?
I think we need to have a collective work, and when we call for advocacy for democratic change in Syria, this is should the voice which need to be heard all over the places. That not only necessarily change the regime, but also have a democratic Syria, because Syrian people deserve democracy. And also, I would like to mention something or add to what Basma has said. We need to create a critical mass of women of politicians who could carry the right to change in the country. It's not enough to have one woman or two women who are considered to be an exceptional. We need to have a critical mass of Syrian women who knows how to do the right politics to achieve democracy and to fulfill human rights agenda in Syria. And maybe this is an area where your country can have an intervention by supporting high-profile women, political capacity building, networking. So this is we were talking this morning, maybe having a committee of politicians where they can network and get prepared to have a critical mass to work together and to be able to make the change. I experienced this myself. When you have one person or two persons who believe in reform or who believe in change, the whole system will kick you out. Because you need people who work with you, who have the same agenda, and we should always focus on human rights, development, and social justice and democracy as the agenda for the future of Syria.
I would like to ask for a warm round of applause for these two sheroes, Muna, Basma. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, quite a leap maybe from Syria to LGBT rights, but this is democracy 2.0, so hey, we're going to leap. I would like to give the floor to Koen van Dijk, Director of COC Netherlands.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I must have overlooked some crucial bit of information for this afternoon because I wrote my speech in English, in Dutch. But I'll translate as I go. I have to go back to the text and ask your forgiveness for any hesitations and maybe small blunders. Professor Kamminga already referred to the visit of President Putin to the Netherlands on Monday last week. It was a celebratory visit, celebrating 400 years of friendly relations between our two nations. And the community of lesbian women, gay men, bisexuals and transgenders in the Netherlands took the opportunity to add extra extravagance to the celebration by celebrating an extra gay pride right next to the place where President Putin was offered his dinner by our government. We in the Netherlands, we have this possibility to be visible, to claim our space in public life and to make our voices heard very loud and clear. Our brothers and sisters in Russia do not have this possibility, and the possibilities that they do have are getting smaller and smaller every year. Putin's Russia presents itself as an alternative model for Europe, a society where government controls and regulates the life of its citizens, and where universal human rights are infringed upon. And in a society where human rights are under pressure, it is the vulnerable groups that often get hit the hardest. In a society where more than 80% of the population has a hostile feelings about sexual diversity and diversity in gender expression, lesbian women, gay men, bisexuals and transgenders and intersex people, LGBTI people, are mostly vulnerable. You would expect the government to protect them and help them in their emancipation process. Not so in Putin's Russia. In his country, our colleague LGBT organizations, like Coming Out St. Petersburg and the Russian LGBT Network, are hampered in their work, and they are pushed back into the dark. It is impossible for them to fight for the rights of the LGBTI community in Russia. LGBTI rights are no special rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is applicable to all people, including those with a different sexual orientation or gender identity. However, in many countries in the world, the human rights of LGBTI people are trodden heavily. I will come with some examples. The freedom of organization is infringed upon, as LGBTI organizations are not allowed to form an organization or register. The freedom of expression is infringed upon, as in St. Petersburg, a man is arrested for going into the street with a sign that says, "My best friend is a lesbian woman, and my wife and I are very fond of her." The right to adequate health support is infringed upon when a country makes it impossible to have specific campaigns targeting HIV prevention among men who have sex with men, or like when recently in the United States, a man was arrested only because he insisted at sitting at the bedside of his sick man, his husband, in hospital. Imagine being a girl of 14 years old somewhere in St. Petersburg, and like many thousands girls of your age in London and Maastricht and Kerala and Baghdad, you feel that your feelings for your girlfriends are different than the feelings they have. But in your country, there's not a COC or an Espresso where you can go to a social club. In your school library, there's no book that reflects your life. All girls of your age in movies fall in love with guys. The Russian Claudia de Brey and the Russian Irene Wüst are very private about their private lives. And in the Russian Viva, there are no letters published by girls that have the same questions or feelings that you have. And in Russia, even if a teacher in school would be willing to come to you and say, it's okay to be who you are, and you will not be alone all of your life, this teacher is threatened with very severe financial fines and even imprisonment. The Russian anti-propaganda law is a vicious anti-gay law. And Russia is not alone, not alone even in the European space. In Ukraine, there's similar legislation in parliament. Lithuania does not recognize gender identity and calls transgendered people sick. Hungary has just changed their constitution to exclude same-sex partners from any kind of partner registration. What can Holland do about this situation? Holland plays an important part in addressing these sensitive issues. Professor Kamminga also mentioned this. One of these sensitive issues is human rights infringement on the LGBTI communities. Last week, our Prime Minister, Minister Rutte, has had a very strong dialogue with President Putin, and you, Minister Timmermans, has also addressed these issues with your colleague Lavrov. We and our brothers and sisters in Russia are very grateful that you take this stand. But also on other levels, this position of the Dutch government is very important within the EU, the Council of Europe, and especially in the United Nations. It is there that at this time a very strong cultural debate is going on the interpretation of human rights being also applicable to the situation of LGBTI citizens. It is extremely important that a country like the Netherlands keeps taking the position that all human rights indeed are universal, and that governments have the responsibility to protect everybody within their country. In the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of progress at the United Nations. There's a growing coalition of countries who will want to carry this flag forwards. Countries like France, South Africa, countries in Latin America and Asia, and not the least, the United States have joined this coalition. But where people are raising the rainbow flag, also the opposition will mount. And there's a strong coalition of conservative states, like Egypt, Sudan, Iran, Russia, and Vatican. And they call upon traditional and family values to counter our position in this debate. We are very happy to see growing support from the structures within the United Nations. And it was only this week that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who's the first Secretary General that spoke out on these issues. Only last week at a conference in Oslo, he gave another very, very strong statement where he said that the human rights, the struggle for LGBTI rights is one of the great human rights challenges of our time, and we must set these rights wrong. He brought forward very strongly that traditional values have been used before to justify slavery, child marriage, rape within marriages, and female mutilation. We expect our Dutch government to keep on bringing forward the position that LGBT rights are indeed universal human rights. As already addressed, Putin's response last week shows that we do need to have our own house in order. In the Netherlands, where a big progress was made only recently when now it's getting difficult, it is no longer obligatory for transgenders to be medically sterilized before they can change their passport. There's a recent change in Dutch law. But still, we have the debate on Thursday with unclear outcome on de weigerambtenaar. And still in Holland, Christian schools can send away teachers and students that come out of the closet too far. As I've said repeatedly, it's very important for us that the Dutch government directly speaks in multilateral and bilateral situations on these issues. It is also very important that they support LGBTI movements in the Global South. A strong LGBTI movement makes it possible that people address their own governments on their responsibilities to protect the LGBTI movement or community in their world, in their country. It is the LGBTI movements that have really pushed the agenda at the UN in the last 10 years in this important cultural dialogue that I just spoke about. It is these movements that on the ground, with in-depth knowledge of cultural traditions and vocabulary, can engage with their political leaders, their religious leaders, their media organizations, and slowly build on coalitions to make a change in paradigm in the way people think about sexual diversity. These striders for love really do need our support. And maybe more than targeting President Putin with our Gay Pride celebration last Monday, we came out as support for our brothers and sisters in Russia. There was a deep felt longing by the Dutch LGBTI community to let our Russian brothers and sisters know that they are not alone and they are heard. We are watching Putin. He may put out a gag order in your own country, but we are watching him and we are coming out of the closet to let him know that he is on the wrong side of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Koen van Dijk, COC Nederland. The next speaker actually needs no introduction, especially not, of course, in his hometown. It is an honor to give the floor to Your Excellency, Mr. Frans Timmermans.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Great to see all of you. I was indeed born in this 1960s. And a year previously, 1960, got married. fired from a job because she got married. Netherlands, something's not working perfectly well. Should I try and remove this, or? I leave it here? No, it doesn't work. I'll use that. Is that better? Yeah. Just to, to put things into a bit of a historic perspective, my mom was fired from a job in 1960 just for getting married. And if I look around me now, and I see who's sitting here 50-odd years later, most of the students are girls, females, women, ladies. Most of the professors are still men, overwhelmingly so in the Netherlands, even in the international comparison. I think in this continent only Georgia has less women professors or something like that. So we still have a long way to go at that level. But I know today that my daughters are not in a disadvantageous position when they want to go to university as compared to my mom's generation or even my generation. So we do sometimes make some progress in certain areas. I want to say this specifically when I listen to the heroes and sheroes who've been speaking here today, that even looking back at our own history, you can see that things unimaginable can be achieved within less than a lifetime. When I was 15 years old, I felt the urge to go and help people in Spain who were then struggling to remove the last remnants of dictatorship from their society. And I went to work for a summer in a farm in Spain. And people were almost starving. They all had stomach problems because the only thing they were eating all day were oranges, because there was little else to eat. And there was endemic violence in every household. Sometimes I thought that the only form of communication within a household was for the father to hit the mother and the children. That was Spain at the time. Spain has same-sex marriage today. A Catholic country, unimaginable, 10, 15 years ago. The French Senate adopted the law on same-sex marriage last week. Unimaginable, even 10 years ago. Do people go out in the streets and protest against that? Yes, they do. Is that a problem? No, it isn't. No human right was ever achieved without a struggle. No human right was ever achieved without a level of discomfort. For moral reasons, cultural reasons, political reasons. But that should never discourage us from pursuing the improvement of human rights worldwide. If I try and explain to my own kids, why human rights? I always ask them, do you want to live your life the way you choose? Yes. Do you want to love the person you choose to love? Yes. Do you want to choose a job or an education to your liking? Yes. Do you want that for others as well? Yes, of course. If you want it for others as well, we better get cracking, because there are billions of people on this earth who still do not have the possibility to choose the way they want to live, who cannot openly say who they wish to love, who cannot have the same career opportunities that are granted to people from another gender, who cannot speak out against the authorities without the risk of being imprisoned, who have no chance for a job because they're black, or because they're Jewish, or because they're Serb, or because they're Albanian, or whatever. As long as that exists, we still have a job to do. I passionately believe in human rights, not just because Max van der Stoel was my political father, but for the same reasons he always expressed. If there's a problem with human rights, you can bet your bottom dollar there's a problem with democracy. There's a problem with the rule of law. And funnily enough, if you see problems arising with human rights, this is probably the best indicator that very soon there will be a problem with democracy and the problem with the rule of law. So there is no distinction to be made between human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And you cannot build a just and sustainable society without human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And you need three elements. Let's take a look at the Arab world today. People found freedom they never had. True. Great good. They have elections which are democratic. Right. And then the party is elected by democratic means, then says, on religious or other grounds, we have the majority, so we are now in a position to take away rights for women or other people, or minorities and others. That's democracy. We were elected. Then our answer should be, sorry, no, it doesn't work like that. Democracy is also contained within constitutional arrangements that should guarantee the rule of law and guarantee human rights. And democracy cannot go beyond the borders of those elements. And if that threatens to happen, like now in Egypt, we should speak out again. Yes, the Brotherhood won the election. It's a triumph for democracy for the first time in 4,000 or 5,000 years in Egypt. A great achievement. But it does not give them the right to curtail the rights of women, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of ethnic minorities, and we should be very vocal about this. It applies not just to Egypt. It is one of the big challenges we will see in the Arab world in the next generation. How do we make sure that progress in democracy does not lead to regress in terms of the position of human rights defenders, specifically in the position of women and in the position of minorities? This will be one of the biggest elements I will have to look at, and we will have to look at collectively in the next couple of years. Practice what you preach is what you said, Professor. And I couldn't agree more. If you want to be not just in a political position or a legal position, but specifically in a moral position, to say to someone like President Putin, you have signed the European Declaration on Human Rights. You are party to the European Treaty. You are subject to the judgments, to the rulings of the European Court on Human Rights. You are member of the Council of Europe. Therefore, you should respect your obligations. You should allow people the right to express themselves. Freedom of expression, it's part of the European Charter on Human Rights. You should allow people to meet with people they want to meet. It's a freedom enshrined in the European Charter on Human Rights. Then his reaction will be, as you said, rightfully, but you have problems in the Netherlands. You allow a political party that does not allow women to be elected. And my reaction was very clear. We have been corrected by the European Court on Human Rights, and we shall abide by that ruling. That is our duty as a treaty-signing country. Then he said, but you have an organization which promotes pedophilia. Martin. We said, well, if that is allowed in the realm of our legal system and we don't agree, we will change the law, if that is necessary. They are protected by the law in the Netherlands. Perhaps this is not a good thing. This is what the judge upheld. That is what it is to be in a rule of law-based country. The judge decides. And if we don't like the law, we change the law. And we have parliament to do that. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, this old Soviet tactic of hitting back with a subject should not lead to avoiding the debate, but indeed to be open to criticism, because there is reason for criticism to every single country. There is no country on this earth that can claim to be completely free of human rights problems. Not the Netherlands, not any other country. And the only attitude I can take as a foreign minister is to say we are open for business 24/7 to hear your complaints, to respond to them, and if we are corrected, we will accept that correction by the judges who will apply that correction. Another subject I want to raise, which is now very topical, and I listened very carefully to you. Can you accept the argument that human rights are a Western invention and a part of cultural imperialism? Well, the answer can be very simple. Human right is something you claim for yourself, and I'm sure everybody around the world, as an individual, would claim the same right for themselves. But by going as somebody from the Netherlands elsewhere and telling people how they should behave because that's human rights, might play into the hands of those who are saying, see, this is a form of cultural imperialism. It doesn't belong to our culture. LGBTI is a perfect example of what you see in Russia. Why? The church doesn't want it. Or in Africa. Why? It runs counter to African culture, etc. So we need to think about that. How do you deal with that? Do you then give up on that? Absolutely not. Unacceptable. There's two ways I thought we could improve the situation. Two new, relatively new ways of approaching the issue. First of all, in every single country we talk about, there will be extremely courageous individuals or groups standing up for those rights. In every country you will find them. It will be our duty, our holy duty, to support those courageous people from here. So one of my absolute priorities will be the support of human rights activists within their society, in their country. They cannot be subject to the reproach that they are not working in a cultural context, because they are from that country and that region. Secondly, an approach I think is very promising, and you mentioned it as well. We have partners in other parts of the world who perhaps have a different pace in developing their thinking, who perhaps have different avenues to promote these rights. But I think I can reach more, arguably, for LGBT rights in certain African countries. If I don't speak out myself, but help activists, officials from South Africa or other countries who are developing their thoughts in this area to express themselves in those other countries. They will not be seen as neo-colonialists or imperialists. They will be seen as part of the society. Same applies to Latin America, where you see Brazil taking an active stance in human rights issues. I want to work with Brazil in other countries, support Brazil where I can, have them be in the driving seat, but we can still support their activities. I was recently, a month ago, I was in Indonesia, which is challenged in all sorts of ways in human rights, but I do believe the Indonesian government has a long-term vision of improving human rights. Do we always agree with the pace? Do we always agree with the subject? No. But this is a very, very important country in a very important region, actively thinking about the rule of law, developing the rule of law, developing more regional autonomy, developing human rights. I would be honored to be part of that development, not by telling them exactly what they should do, but helping them where they want to develop their policies, to develop them further, and also cooperating with them in third countries where they know societies better than we do, and we perhaps have some instruments of human rights improvement we can add to their toolbox and perhaps even improve. Now, practice what you preach, use other triangular forms of cooperation, defend human rights activists, look at the position of women, which is so crucial in society. LGBTI is something everybody identifies with. Why are these my priorities? Why not other priorities? Well, we also have other subjects we look at and we put emphasis on. But I have a couple of reasons why these subjects are priorities to me. First of all, because I believe that these subjects relate fundamentally to the values that are very, very broadly shared in Dutch society. And it makes it easier for me, as a representative of that society, to be active in areas where I know that Dutch society is passionately involved in and believes in. We express the values we share in this society. These values aren't eternal. It took us a whole struggle to reach this insight or this belief. And we are nowhere near the end of this development. But at the state we are now, where we believe men and women should be treated exactly the same way. And still in the Netherlands we have problems in that. Still, in some respects, women do not get equal pay for the same job in this country as men do. Still a problem we need to solve. But by and large, we find it absolutely unthinkable that women should be discriminated against. So we should stand for that internationally. We also believe that every individual has the right to choose who they want to love, whether it's somebody with same sex or a different sex, or somebody who had a different sex first and changed their sex. That is your freedom. Authorities should not and never be allowed to intervene with that choice. That is a personal matter, and we will fight for it worldwide, because European experience in the last 20 or 15 years shows that in this area, what we deemed unthinkable 10 years ago is absolutely day-to-day business today, in even countries in Southern Europe where this seemed unimaginable very recently. So why not in Africa? Why not in Asia? Why not in Latin America? Well, actually in Latin America there is already, in several places, the possibility of same-sex marriage, for instance. And of course in Russia it will take longer. But I'm not without hope that we will get this off the ground. I was in Russia recently, and I spoke to the LGBTI community in Moscow. And they were in two minds. They were afraid about the developments that might occur now under pressure of this sort of redefining Russianness, and in this context adopting an anti-gay attitude. But at the same time they were saying in Moscow and St. Petersburg, we've seen sort of a more relaxed attitude towards gays in the last couple of years. And we should build on that, and we should push back these ideas that people should not be allowed to be who they are. Socioeconomic rights are something you mentioned as well. Why is this a contradiction? Perhaps for those of you, most of you, who never even heard, well, you've read about the Cold War and the ideological confrontation. I was brought up in that confrontation, and in those years, we always had this debate, exactly in the same vein as Putin does now. When we would talk about civil and political rights, they would always react by, yes, haha. But in our system, you have social economic rights. You can't be fired. You always have a salary. You always have a home, etc., etc. Those are the rights we champion. And we were in this dichotomy for too long, leading to the fact today that there is, I believe, too little attention for social economic rights in the Western world, because it's still sort of a remnant of that old dichotomy between East and West, where these rights were sort of posed one against the other. And why should we leave this behind us? Because if you look at women's rights, of course they are civil and political rights, But they are, in most parts of the world, essentially socioeconomic rights where we need to fight for. The right to ownership, the right to inherit, the right to keep a job, the right to go to school. I mean, these things are also socioeconomic rights. The right not to be stripped of ownership when you divorce or when you are rejected by your husband. It's not just civil, political, it's also socioeconomic. So I'm going to try and redefine these things also in terms of socioeconomic rights. Now, another issue I want to raise, and I really would like to hear your comments on this. We will have to change our instruments because there are new instruments. Not so long ago, some loony guy in Korea invented a weird dance. Sound of recognition here. Within a couple of weeks, it was a global phenomenon. This is unthinkable 10 years ago. This is thanks to the internet and Google and YouTube, etc., etc. How will we put that to use for human rights? You tell me, because I believe the power of this instrument, because it can, whatever authorities try, it cannot be put under full control of authorities. So the power that you can generate by showing stuff on the internet and thus make it accessible to the whole world could be huge. But we need young people like yourselves thinking up ways of making sure that something that pops up somewhere and has a human right connotation is spread around the internet so quickly that it cannot be removed by oppressive authorities. We need to think about that, because I believe seeing is knowing in this modern world. You can write 10 texts about a human rights violation, but you put the face of a young man severely beaten in the streets of Paris for being gay. You put that face on television, and there will be an immediate outcry, because then people don't read about it, but they see it and thus feel it. And we need to use those instruments more than we have in the past, because we have them at our disposal. And perhaps old farts like myself aren't able enough to do that. But you have no excuse. You have no excuse whatsoever not to find the ways of reaching the global community about human rights violations via new instruments. Anyway, I found this an inspiring session, not just today, but also the reactions I got on the internet. On my Facebook page, please join us. It's an interesting community, a lot of controversy. Sometimes people like you, then they hate you again, and you know how it goes on the internet. Fun. Almost like real life, only a bit intenser perhaps. People feel less inhibited to express themselves, which is a good thing, essentially. Do try and use those instruments. Create them yourselves. Human rights is a cause worth struggling for. It is a cause that will always create discomfort, not just when I talk to my Russian friends and colleagues. I often encounter discomfort when you raise human rights issues, and it is then tempting in contacts to avoid them. You know, you don't want to, sorry, I have to raise this, I'm sorry, but we have a moral obligation to look for this feeling of discomfort. Because what is my discomfort compared to the feelings of a young man who is beaten to a pulp in the streets of St. Petersburg because some right-wing movement feels justified in their homophobia by the expressions of the authorities? What is that in relation to my discomfort? What is my discomfort in relation to the horrific story Angela just told us about what happened to people in the Philippines? Nothing. Nothing. And all our collective discomforts should not stop us from doing this. I truly believe this. But of course, the Netherlands can't do this on their own. We can't do this on our own. I see a tendency in the European Union that worries me. That member states say, well, we now have a human rights special representative and we have Ms. Cathy Ashton. Let them address the issue of human rights. Yes, please, Cathy, go to Russia and talk to them on human rights so that we don't have to. That is a very, very worrying development, and we should be immune against that development. It will only work if we all talk the same message, the same way, all the time. And we cannot put Cathy Ashton or Van Rompuy or the Human Rights Special Representative in the awkward position of having to do our bidding and then us ourselves being freed of that obligation. I think this is something I will fight for within the group of foreign ministers of the European Union. But at the end of the day, this will only be sustainable. I can only do this, and my colleagues can only do this, if there is a strong public support for human rights. Please, if I can ask you one thing, now at the end of my speech, take upon yourself the obligation, every individual one of you here, to talk to at least 10 people in the next couple of days about the importance of human rights and why you believe human rights are important. Possibly for completely different reasons than mine. Doesn't matter. Just why it is important. Spread the word. Because I do believe, as was said by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., things will not change by themselves. Things will only change if we go through the painstaking activity of bringing things ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, stay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Timmermans. I ask you to stay with me because this is the time we would like to start our Q&A. And actually, the Q&A has already started a while back because you asked for input and questions on your Facebook page. How many friends do you have right now?
I think, well, it's a fan page, so how many likes?
How many likes?
About 14,200, more or less.
That's quite
so
impressive.
So you can add some to that if you wish tonight.
So if you feel like asking the minister a question, you can still send them through Facebook or Twitter using the hashtag MR2013. But we already gathered some interesting questions that were, coming in over the past few days. And let's have a look at the first one. Ernst Jan van Doorn. He is saying if the EU has human rights in their core values and says that they should be promoted and protected, shouldn't the EU have more instruments to actually practice what they preach and confront their member states more efficiently and more effectively?
Yes, I think he is absolutely, Ernst Jan van Doorn is absolutely right. That is why we took the initiative, my German colleague Westerwelle, my Danish colleague and my Finnish colleague, the four of us took the initiative of writing a letter to all our colleagues saying that within the EU we should monitor the development of the rule of law in member states. Because we've sort of delegated that to the Council of Europe, which has good instruments for that. But at the same time, we've also said the EU should not be criticized too much, and we've had this Haider experience, where at some stage there was a reaction to the FPÖ leader Haider joining the Austrian government, and many governments in the EU then said we don't want to be involved with the Austrian government. This horribly backfired, and since then governments are very reluctant to address human rights problems in other member states, and now what we see is we need an instrument to do this as Council. We don't have the instrument in place. I'm very glad that the President of the European Commission, Barroso, took the initiative of writing to the Hungarian government in saying the constitution, the changes in the constitution are at odds, I put it very carefully, with your EU obligations. But I think we should not only leave this to the European Commission, I think the Council should be in a position to deliberate about these things itself.
Thank you. And thank you, Ernst Jan van Doorn. I don't know if you're watching us through the live stream, but thank you for asking your question. Now, let's see if there are any questions in the audience. Oh, we have one in the middle, right there. Can you reach him by... we have people with microphones in the audience. So if you could please introduce... Yeah, almost. Almost. If you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Nart Huibrechts. I'm a student public policy at the Maastricht Graduate School of Government. And I truly enjoyed your vivid speech on human rights. And I would like to highlight one aspect. You said that human rights, rule of law and democracy are fundamentally one. But meanwhile, I also would like to emphasize that our current government is cutting 4 billion in funding, that is, whether it's directly or indirectly aimed at strengthening these mechanisms. Aren't we prioritizing our own welfare over human rights at this point in time?
4 billion?
4 billion in humanitarian aid.
Ah, well, it's not. We're not cutting 4 billion.
Sorry.
We are it is true that we are cutting back on development cooperation 1 billion. We are, part of this will be restructured in different instruments having to do with international security and with an investment fund. But you're absolutely right that it becomes more difficult to ascertain your international position if you have less funds. Having said that, we do not cut our funds for human rights promotion. We did not cut €1 in our funds for human rights promotion, even my colleague Minister Ploemen increased the funds she has at her disposal to promote women's rights. So in that sense, on the human rights issue, there is no cutback. But you're absolutely right that we spend less on development cooperation than we did before. And of course, development cooperation is a very important human rights instrument because it creates development and therefore economic opportunity, the possibility of a middle class arising, and people who do not have the need to fight day by day just to survive will be able to promote their rights individually and collectively in a better way.
Thank you. There was a lady wearing orange. I don't know if you can... Yes.
Actually, that wasn't the reason why I wore orange, but my name is Annemarie Rima. I'm a member of the Amnesty International group here in Maastricht. And of course, we have the activities on Russia this year and on the alien detention. But as you might know, we have this special case here in Maastricht, which is our own group member, Abdullah al-Mansouri, who is in prison now in Iran for already 7 years. Next to me is his son, Adnan al-Mansouri, and we want to ask you, he's a Dutch civilian, so what do you want to do to get him free out of Iran and imprisoned and back here in Maastricht with his family?
It is a very, very painful case. For those of you who don't know, Mr. al-Mansouri was arrested, not in Iran. He was picked up in a neighboring country and then deported to Iran and put into Iranian prison. And the Iranians say that he's not a Dutch citizen, he's an Iranian citizen. He has, in fact, dual citizenship. We maintain that he is a Dutch citizen and therefore we should have full access to him to give him consular support. This is always on the top of my priorities whenever there is any contact with Iranian authorities. We want to go and see Mr. al-Mansouri in his detention in Iran, and we want him freed. Let there be no mistake about this. And I just can tell you one thing, it is on the top of my priorities in my relationship with, very difficult relationship, frankly, with Iran.
Thank you. First, the gentleman over here, maybe it's closer for you if you, yeah, from this side should be. If you could please introduce yourself.
A very good afternoon. My name is Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry. I'm from International Human Rights Commission. First of all, my compliments for Mr. Kaminga that you mentioned over the ratification issues of the Netherlands over Charter of Human Rights. The second thing, Mr. Timmermans, you could prove yourself that you have the potential to lead Netherlands, not as a minister, but as a prime minister. Because you are the one who could prove yourself that you are a global thinker. You have the vision, you have the knowledge, you have the courage to speak out. So you are talking about, not about yourself only, you are not talking about the Netherlands, but you are talking about the world which needs solidarity and harmony and peace. So I'll come to a question. The military interventions all over the world could never ever prove success. They have been always reason of worst kind of violation of human rights and the worsening of the law and order situation in those countries. Afghanistan is an example that nothing could be achieved there, but to produce more fanaticism and extremism, not only in Afghanistan, but in the surrounding countries. Coming to my question, the drone attacks, yes, which Mr. Kaminga said that war zone, it is justified to use the war zone. Pakistan, my own country of birth, has been under attack of drone attacks since last many, many years. Pakistan isn't a war zone. There is no combating army which is standing against ISAF over there. But more than 4,000 people are killed by drone attacks. So nobody is giving any answer that how many were terrorists, how many were the targeted persons, but majority of them, more than 80%, have been civilian. So who will answer for that? If we justify that drone attacks, I mean in war zone or somewhere else are justified, to kill them, not to allow the culprits or the accused to stand in for a trial and to provide them, I mean, all legal support to prove them guilty or not guilty. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very poignant and difficult question. I would take issue with the general remark that military intervention is by definition a bad thing that always leads to crisis. Without military intervention, this country might still be under German or Nazi occupation. Without military intervention, Croatia would not be on the doorstep of the European Union. But I grant you that some military interventions did not produce the results that people anticipated and led to a lot of human suffering. So you have a point, but it's not an absolute point, if I may take it up with you in that way. On the drones, and Professor Kaminga raised it as well, and he's absolutely right, we are challenged. We are challenged as always in human history. Man is a very inventive being. And so man always invents new weapons. But man is less inventive as to developing law. So we first develop weapons and only then start thinking about whether we could find legal instruments to prevent those weapons to put to wrong use. And drones are a case in point. I think the temptation of using drones, because it is, I don't mean to sound cynical, but it is in certain analyses a very effective and efficient a weapon system with low risk because it doesn't have a person flying the drone. So if it's shot down, you only have a material problem and not another problem. That leads to the threshold of using the drone being dropped. And that can lead to a serious human rights problem and other legal problems. So what we need is a legal instrument to regulate the use of these weapons, such as we've also developed in the past legal instruments to apply to other weapons. Banning drones altogether, I think we've passed that point. Drones are being used and will be used, I think, globally, not just by the United States. They are being developed in arguably all regions of the world. They will be used as an instrument both in a civilian and in a military capacity. What we need to do is develop human rights compatible legal instruments to control the use of drones. I have asked, I have an advisory committee of international lawyers. I've asked them to write an opinion for me as to what legal instruments could be developed to make sure that this new weapon system is sort of contained in the legal system that would comply with human rights. This might sound terribly naive, and probably it is, but I still think that given our position internationally and given our moral obligation, dosed with a measure of realism because the weapon exists and will be used, leads me to the conclusion that the best contribution I can make is to try and come up with a legal system that could contain the use of drones. But your point is very compelling and very true, and the issue of what they call euphemistically collateral damage, civilian people hurt, should be addressed at the international level with more intensity than we have done in the last decade or two.
I will like to ask you to park your questions for a second, because I just heard that we have some more questions coming in online. And actually they're both about women's rights, human rights or women's rights. Netherlands should advocate for women as powerful agents in conflict. Speaking about that, in my capacity as former UN women's representative, I happen to know that 1325 is high on the Dutch agenda. Are you continuing that, that tradition, that famous Dutch tradition?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and you now have two ministers competing to be the champions of women's rights. So, you know, I hope for a great competition between Lilianne Ploemen and myself on this issue, because it can only help the issue of women's rights. You know, especially now with these fundamental developments in the Arab world, I think one could say that the Arab awakening can lead to a dream if women are put in the right position, can lead to a nightmare if women are excluded from the right position. This is, I think, this dichotomy, I believe in this dichotomy. If we exclude women from their rights, if we exclude them from political position, if we force them in a position that is culturally or religiously motivated of inferiority, this will turn into a nightmare for the Arab world. If we can put women in a position that they enjoy full rights, that democracy as it develops applies gender neutrally, then I believe the Arab awakening can still turn into a dream. And it's just one example. You know, I lived in Russia for more than 3 years. This country is run by women. It's not run by men. It's run by women. And they still don't have the position they deserve in that country and elsewhere. Look at Africa. Africa has a very powerful women's movement, has very powerful female leaders, but still they don't organize themselves globally to an extent that could reinforce their position, and African women should be in a leading position to reinforce women's rights elsewhere in the world. As you know, when God created man, she was only joking.
Now, let's have a look. By the way, thank you, Ilse Smit, for reminding us of that point. Sophie Hermans is talking about female genital mutilation. And she would like to remind us all that female genital mutilation should be included in Dutch cooperation within EU and UN.
Yes.
How high is that on the agenda right now?
That is very high on our agenda because we know it's going to take a long, long time for this practice to be eradicated. And it's going to take especially an application of women from the same culture to bring this about. If I were as a man from the Netherlands, to go to Somalia and tell a Somali mother that it is very unwise for her to apply circumcision or whatever you want to call it to her daughter, she would just laugh at me. Who am I to think about these things? But if you can find emancipated, strong Somali women to go and talk to this Somali mother and remind this mother how she herself suffered because of genital mutilation, she might consider not doing this to her daughter. So those are the things we need to do, and we need to really fight for this. And here again, you know, successes are attainable. You now see increasing numbers of communities where genital mutilation is put into the debate, and people are avoiding this practice more and more. And I think that that is something worth fighting for, because, as you know, who am I to talk about this? But you very often, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali has described, you very often condemn women to a life of very, very intense discomfort, and purely for religious and cultural reasons.
Thank you. Now, we have time for one last round of... well, I'm afraid that we will not be able to answer all of your questions, but we haven't heard from anybody in front, so let me give you the mic.
Thank you very much. You want to keep it? I would like to ask you... I would like to ask you, Excellency, you spoke of raising human rights issues even when it brings discomfort, and you gave the LGBTI community and their issues as an example. But there are other groups and other issues as well, of course. I think, for instance, of sex workers and their rights, drug users and their rights, and especially their lack of human rights, which is often a barrier for them to access healthcare, for instance. Are you going to address this in your new policy as well in these groups?
Thank you.
Well, absolutely. What we can do in that context, we know a number of countries in Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and others, where the main reason for the spread of HIV/AIDS is people sharing needles, drug addicts sharing needles. So if you try and sort of take a step back from the moral issue and then go to the authorities and tell them you have a serious public health problem here, which is spreading. And by the way, we have found ways in our country to contain this and to combat this and to eradicate this. Won't you come over, you authorities, and see how we do this? And by the way, when you go back, we will provide you with a batch of needles and other support, etc., etc. This works. Not enough, but it's starting to work. It's starting to work in a number of countries like Moldova, etc. But you are absolutely right. This deserves attention. And sometimes, if you don't put it in a moral context, but you put it into a context, for instance, of public health, it gives the other side the opportunity to sort of step away from the moral issue and also step away from their own, perhaps even personal, inhibitions. Because coming back to LGBTI, I just want to mention one thing. In some of my colleagues, when I address the issue, I really see a personal discomfort. They still, frankly, I believe my grandparents, coming from this region, being very, very Roman Catholic, would probably have felt the same discomfort if I were to say to them, your son or grandson is going to marry a man. They would have felt the same discomfort because they were raised to see this, to see same-sex relations as an illness, as a deviation, etc. So some of my colleagues, when I raise the issue, have the same reaction of discomfort for that reason. But that doesn't, mean that I shouldn't raise it. It just, and I'm not going to tell them you should feel differently about that. You abhor your homosexuality? Fine, that's your choice. But that doesn't give you the right to take away the rights of homosexuals to live their lives the way they want to live it. That is a sort of debate I want to have. And one final remark on this, not always saying because we believe this, no, very often the countries I speak to, the ministers I speak to, have subscribed to obligations internationally where this is enshrined. So I say to them, not because we say so, but look, you've subscribed to that. Look, is this your signature? Well, then do what we've agreed. And then they will say, ha, but you also don't do what you've agreed. Fine, talk to me. I'll address the issue.
We have space for one last question. Oh, this is so hard. This is so hard, but I'm going to be, because you've raised your hand for a long time, so I'm going to give you the mic. I'm sorry for all the other people who still had questions. You can actually still tweet them using the hashtag MR2013, and they will still be collected, won't they? Yes, they will. So.
Hi, I'm Faith. I'm a student here doing my Master's in Globalization and Law, focusing on human rights. And my question is, you've talked
Where are you
a lot.
from, Faith?
I'm from England, but my family is originally from Kenya. So I have a bit of a interesting background. Anyway, my question is just simple, that you talked a lot about other issues in human rights, but I haven't heard you say anything about human trafficking, which I see this not enough information, not enough publicity out there, even though it's a global problem. I think that anything from 27 million people are in slavery now, which is more so than, back in the 1700s when it was abolished. And, it'd be good to know what your policy will be and how that will be factored into your human rights policy. And also what the Dutch government, based here, is actually doing to let people aware, not just locally, about that there is a problem in Europe, and it's actually quite a big problem, and how to spot people who are, trafficked, whether it's for forced labor, whether it's in, like in Holland, where sex workers, it's quite legal and pretty much out there. So that was my point.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And how you protect trafficked people once they're in the country.
Thank you. So awareness and protection.
Wow, this really is an extremely important but also extremely difficult question, Faith, I have to say. Because just to give you an example of Mali at this stage, when we analyze the situation in Mali or in the Sahel, what you see is that a lot of people operate on a business model where they can make money by smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons, and trafficking people. And especially if that business model is built to generate money for bombs and weapons, it is a direct threat to our security. The people who are being trafficked choose to be trafficked or are obliged by people who they listen to in their home countries and towns because they see no opportunity for their future and the future of their children in their own country. So the only way you can fundamentally address the issue, and that comes back to the criticism I fully understand the gentleman made there, the only real solution to this problem is creating more opportunity for development. More opportunity for development. Nobody, arguably nobody really wants to leave their country if they don't have to, if they can build a future in their own country. So when people leave and when they take the risk of falling into the hands of traffickers, they do this out of despair because they don't want to starve. So the fundamental solution here is to create more opportunity in the countries people come from. It's not always development cooperation. I think we are still not making enough headway in liberalizing our trade. We're still not making enough headway in creating opportunity for investment. And so we still have a long way to go. On the other hand, looking at Africa, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. So there is opportunity in that continent that was once silly enough called the lost continent. But we still need to cooperate more with other countries in identifying these smuggling routes, in identifying who's in charge of them, in prosecuting the people who are in charge. In the Netherlands, I think we're in the process of getting rid of our naive attitude towards sex workers and regulating sex workers. I think we had been too naive in the past in thinking that if you regulate it, this is just a normal business like any other business. There are too many examples, clear examples, that women in that line of work very often do not choose to be in that line of work, but are forced to work in that line of work. So we have a huge task here, and we don't have the solution yet. We've not done enough in Europe, in the Netherlands, internationally, to combat this issue, which is also sapping away at the very lifeline of those countries, because it is always the most talented, the healthiest, the best trained people who are trafficked out of the country. So I'm sorry I don't have a panacea. I'm sorry I don't have a complete answer to your question, but you are absolutely right to raise the urgency of this. We need to work on this together. We need Europe to do much more than Europe is doing today. And we need, in the Netherlands, to revisit some of our preconceptions on the sex industry and on other industries, also in agriculture, where people are exploited, even sometimes up to the point of slavery.
Thank you. I just understood from our ground control that there is one last point being made on Twitter, and that is the last, Chun Luk, who is saying, should the Netherlands be vocal about human rights violations, even if detrimental to economic well-being? Now, that's an interesting one.
Yes, and here again, the honest answer is that there is no perfect answer. It is very easy for me now, today, to say to you, yes, of course. But that would not be an honest answer. There are always several interests you have to see and balance. Now, the position you are in determines whether raising human rights issues will hurt your economic position. If you raise a human rights issue on your own as a country, and you don't create a coalition, then it is very easy for the other country to single out you and say, we will punish you. No gas from Russia, or whatever. But if you make sure that you do this in a coalition, you know, for instance, LGBTI, there we go again. We had day after day an intense debate with our German colleagues. Let's have the same language here, let's have the same position. I talked to Westerwelle, what did you say to Putin? I'll say the same thing to Lavrov. What did you say? Rutte talked to Merkel and made sure we coordinated our messages. Then you create a coalition, because Germany and the Netherlands, and perhaps a number of other countries jointly, are more important as customers to Russia than Russia is as energy provider to us. So you create a better balance in economic terms. So, you know, the honest answer here is that if I go too far here, I will be corrected by others in society or in government. But if I make sure that I create alliances in Europe and elsewhere, then I can protect myself in my strife from the criticism that I'm hurting our economic interest. But at the end of the day, yes, it can happen. It can happen that we hurt our economic interest. Sometimes we don't export to a country because we believe the human rights situation isn't up to scratch. This hurts our economy, yes, but there are sometimes other considerations that are more important.
Thank you very much for this Q&A. I'm afraid we're running out of time. I would like to ask for a warm round of applause for
Thank you.
Minister Timmermans. Thank you. Thank you. And as the minister is leaving, I would like to thank you for being here and for being so vocal. Of course, I would like to thank all of our speakers. Thank you for your time and your energy, and thank you for sharing your point of view in this important meeting today. And I would like to thank the viewers who joined us through the live stream. And I hope you all keep tweeting using the hashtag MR2013. My name is Kirsten van den Hul. I'm also on Twitter @TheChangeAgent. I hope to see you again, and thank you. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.